Welcome back, everyone. I'm Garrett Weinzierl, and this is Entrepreneuring, where I sit down and talk with someone about their business or their product, or in this case, I'm going to talk with Dr. Rolston St. Hilaire about a maple tree he helped create, which, Dr. Rolston, I feel like this interview is going to write itself because I don't know how to make trees.
Right, and neither do I, but I know how to test them and have them be resilient in stressful environments. And so this is the nature of my creation, actually. My plants were selected from plants that grow in natural environments. And through a rigorous system of testing, I actually came up with a plant that I think will do well for the Intermountain West states. So we're looking at states like New Mexico, Utah.
I was about to say, it sounds like in a dry climate, which isn't necessarily conducive to growing a maple tree. It sounds like the fact that you are a faculty member at NMSU, and so the fact that you're located there it probably helps quite a bit with this type of research.
It does, yes. And one of the advantages in working here in New Mexico as a drought, I call myself a drought stress physiologist. And we don't have to use what's called rain-out shelters. It rains so infrequently here that we could effectively test a plant for drought with just putting it outside and seeing how it does well, stressful environments. Unlike if we're on the East Coast, then we'd have to sort of keep the rain out or conduct the research in a greenhouse environment, and so we're just perfectly suited for doing this. In fact, that's one of the things that actually attracted me to New Mexico State University. The fact is that I was a drought physiologist. I was trained at Iowa State University, and I'm out here, and I'm like, well, I don't have to worry too much about rain. I account for it, but it's not a huge factor in planning my experiments. So,
well, that's great. Well, talk to me about how did you get into this this type of research just to begin with?
Well, to begin with, I mentioned Iowa State a few minutes ago. And while I was at Iowa State, there are plants called black maples and sugar maples. And so most people in the East Coast are very, very familiar with New England fall color and sugar maples. so that piqued my interest. And so I started working on black and sugar maples. And my primary research question was whether the black maples that occur a little bit more westerly, we say, and in this case westerly meaning a little west of Iowa, were a little bit more drought resilient than the sugar maples that occur, let's say, on the East Coast, New York area, Vermont. So in my initial research, I found that the black maples may have had a little bit of what we call drought stress physiology traits that made them a little bit more resilient to dry environments. So let's fast forward now. I got my PhD and did this wonderful research at Iowa State, and I came out here. And I started to look, where are the maples? And so as a scientist, of course, you're thinking, well, if I could duplicate the fall color and have a maple for dry environments, that would be wonderful. But it turns out that, of course, we can't just simply transplant sugar maples from the East Coast and have them test them for dry environments in New Mexico conditions and expect them to survive. And there are a couple of factors that would prevent that. One, the soils in the East Coast, so in Iowa, for example, are more they're more acid. And so those plants don't do well if we were bring them into our calcareous or alkaline soils here. So I look back at the research that had been published on maples for dry environments, and lo and behold, there are a couple plants that were recommended for dry environments like New Mexico. And that's where I sort of stumbled upon some initial research that was done about 3 decades or more ago on big tooth maples. So the recommendation was maybe this plant could work for dry environments, and just began my quest.
Oh, okay. So you started there. So which maple was that?
So I looked up. There's a plant called Acer grandidentatum, and so it is big tooth maples, and it's sort of related to sugar maples. In fact, if you're bought from a botanical standpoint, they're within the same section, we call that. And so Acer grandidentatum, big tooth meaning big teeth, the teeth on those maples are a little bigger than those on sugar maples, but they look similar. But there's one huge difference I noticed. The fall color on this plant, in my opinion, and maybe I'm a little bit tipped or a little biased towards big-tooth maples, but in my opinion, the fall color was a little bit more brilliant than the sugar maples that I saw on the East Coast. And I said, aha, if I could just get this plant tested and introduced to homeowners, I'm sure they would be stunned at the fall color.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, that's very cool. So this all came about. The goal here was to just get the trees to grow for like landscape and decorative purposes, not so much for, say, the production of syrup.
That is very true. In fact, that was the main objective. The main objective was to find a plant that the homeowner or the landscaper can actually use in a landscape setting, and its prime purpose was not for syrup. And in fact, I understand that we could have some syrup from big-tooth maples, but it's not as palatable as the syrup that you get from sugar maples. So that was our primary objective in our research objectives. That was the primary one. Let's try to find a plant that would work for stressful, managed environments in, basically we're looking at the Southwest and into Mountain West. That was the prime purpose.
So what was the starting point? You found this breed of maple tree, and then did you just head right into basically development?
Well, yes. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So let me explain how this actually worked. So we found out that, okay, there is this plant. The first thing we had to do was to identify where these plants occurred. Where were the natural populations of the plant in this dry environment? So we looked at maps, and we went into her barrier, and I called my friends and find out where does this plant grow. And we sort of collated through one graduate student project. Initially we started with that. We collated locational information and distribution patterns and maps of the big-tooth maples. In fact, we spent almost a year just doing that, just trying to find out where the plants grew, who we could contact if we needed to collect material, start locating all the necessary permits and access to those materials. And so we crafted a plan, a year-long plan, to get as much material as we could from those natural populations. And of course, that entailed actually scoping out the areas. And in fact, I did a lot of driving to remote areas to find out and actually see for myself. I hike a bit.
So did you found them, was it locally in New Mexico, or did you have to travel?
I had to travel quite a bit. And so locally in New Mexico, it occurs. And so, for example, one of them I could hike in about 2 hours, about 2 hours from here, I could hike to populations here in New Mexico. But they're far flung as Arizona, somewhere in Utah, various locations in Texas. And in Texas, actually, I would fly, rent a car, and then hike several hours into finding out where those natural populations were. And of course, finding out that I needed some permits and all of that, and arranging to collect material. And so we basically, the plant matures or has seeds from anywhere from very, very late August, September, October, November. And so we initially started collecting seeds from all these natural populations. And so we collected seeds. And in earnest, that research really started in 2000, 2001, when we collected the seeds. The seeds of the maples are called samaras, by the way. So we collected all these samaras, and we brought them back to a lab and figured out a way to get them to germinate, and we began testing them. So.
Oh, great! So you got these seeds together, and then the tests, I'm assuming, were just about how they kind of, how they perform in basically a drought environment.
Exactly, and you were exactly correct there. So what we did was that we grew all the seeds, and by the way, that was not a trivial matter, because we actually had to put the seeds through a process called stratification. And so basically we had to put them in a cold, moist environment for about 16 weeks before they would even germinate, and then we had to find the right mix, we call it, growing media for them to germinate. And these were little things, but we worked those out. We grew those out, and then we began a series of tests on plant materials. So at any one particular point in time, we had 2 greenhouses full of seedling materials. And through initial seedling tests in the greenhouse, we started to see some patterns of plants that would work really good in drought environments. And so our drought testing protocols basically involve growing some plants that are well watered and growing some that are deprived of water and seeing how the plants that are deprived of water are doing. And then based on how the plants perform that are coming from different environments, we began to see some patterns of plants that are coming from particular areas. We call those provenances. We started to find out that some plants from particular areas were doing better than others. And so we started to narrow down our tests in terms of more severe drought testing and then adding additional tests.
And how long was that? Because you mentioned just getting the materials took about a year.
That's correct.
So how long are you now into all this germination and testing and seeing just how the seeds are doing?
Right. So those initial tests take about a year. So we started in about 2000 to collect the seeds in 2000, grew them in 2001. 2002, by the next year, we had some seedling material growing. But it wasn't until about 2003, 2004, so we're looking at 3 years down the road, that we could say, well, there are some plants that are definitely performing better than others. So initially, it takes about a year to get the seedlings to grow, and they're large enough to actually conduct tests on them. And 2 more years down the road, we had materials that could, we said, well, yeah, they look really good. We can start beginning to narrow our selections. Yeah.
Oh, great. So do you remember how, like, once you narrowed down that selection, how many different types of maples were you left with?
That's a good. I like this idea question, because we started. I estimated we had about thousands of seedlings, and at last count, when I counted all the seedlings we grew, we're somewhere in the 3,000 to 4,000 seedling range. So you're looking at a lot of seedling material.
Yeah, absolutely.
But after all our tests, it really came down to 3 genotypes, 3 individual plants that we said, there's 3 plants. And so now we're looking at lots of seedlings, and then we'll narrow it down to just 3 plants. So we had 3 plants which we thought had done extremely well in our drought test, and we had done some additional tests on them. And so we brought these plants outdoors in our New Mexico environment. And because most of our initial testing was done in the greenhouse, we brought those plants outdoors and began to observe them. Now, in addition to testing for the drought characteristics, we also looked at how well they did under salinity conditions. So if we were to put them in very salty soils, how they did. We also looked at how well they did when we exposed them to very, very high light. In other words, if you were to, solar radiation here in our desert environment is very, very important. But some of the traits that we also looked at was, well, how well the plants were showing fall color, which was one of, as I mentioned in the beginning of the interview, I wanted that plant to show really, really good fall color. So although some plants had shown good resilience to drought in our initial testing, they did not have all the fall foliage characteristics that I was looking for. And so although those plants might be resilient to drought, they were not, I consider, the true brilliant crimson, kind of color developed. So those plants essentially were left behind.
And this was out of the 3 genotypes that you whittled yourself down to?
But as the 3 ones, the 3 that I had all those traits. They were showing good fall color. They were drought resistant. And,
okay. I was about to say, I can only imagine the panic you may have felt once you got down to 3 genotypes and some of them were still not producing the color you were hoping for. So never mind.
They were. The 3 were producing the kinds of colars that we wanted.
I was just curious about that. So eventually you narrow down and you now have one specific type of tree. You call it the JFS Numex 3.
That is correct.
Maple
okay,
tree.
so that's correct.
How does the drought resistance work with this tree? What are its characteristics?
Excellent. So I want to back up a little bit. And with the 3 plants that I got, I actually entered into a partnership with a private company at that point to help them further test those plants for me. So in other words, I entered in a partnership with J. Frank Schmidt, which is a commercial company. They are about the largest producers of maples in the United States. So once I had this for individuals, I said, I'm good at killing trees. I'm not very good at actually growing them out in a commercial setting. Would you help me? And we essentially entered into an agreement with them to sort of test those plants in a production setting. And out of those three genotypes, one of them emerged, and that's the JFS Numex 3. And of course, we call it Numex 3 because in the Ag Experiment Station, of which my department is, we have a system of naming cultivars. And so usually we use the acronym NUMEX for New Mexico. And that 3 comes back to the third plant out of the three genotypes I initially selected. So that's where the name comes from, a Numex 3. And the JFS stands for J. Frank Schmidt, which is that private partnership that I had entered into, which is part of their way of naming plants as well that they do testing for. So the characteristics you're asking about. So in that particular JFS Numex 3, there are a couple of really good drought resilient traits. One is that we tested something called its water relations, basically how well water moves through the plant in response to drought. And in this particular plant, it is really resilient. It maintains its growth even under very, very dry, droughty conditions. So that's one of its drought-tolerant traits. Another thing we looked at was how much wax was on the leaves of the plant. So it's like sunscreen. If you have a lot of sunscreen or wax on the leaves, of course, you're more resilient to a dry environment. So this plant has a lot of wax material on its leaves. It's very shiny and glossy. So that makes it pretty effective in keeping its tissues, we call it, hydrated, as well as not losing a lot of moisture because it has this extra layer of protective material. Another trait we saw was that the young leaves, when they emerge in the springtime, they turn out to be sort of a nice bronze color. So that makes it sort of an additional sort of sunscreen material. We call this compounds anthocyanins. And so the young leaves, when they come out, they have this extra sunscreen protection on them, which makes it even more resilient to drought. And one final trait was that the leaves were very resilient to tearing. Maples usually suffer from a characteristic called leaf tatter in high winds, for example, like we get here in New Mexico in the springtime. You see some leaves split open or they shatter or they cut. And so this plant we selected for it not doing that. So it's basically a very glossy, very dark green leaf. And then, of course, fall foliage color. This turns to be a very brilliant crimson color. In fact, it's one of the most brilliant colors that I've seen of any maple in that section. It was for either sugar maples or black maples, and now bigtooth maples. Its color is actually pretty stunning. So with all those traits packaged into one individual plant, we could safely say that we have a plant that's drought tolerant, resilient to dry environments, and of course has the fall foliage color that a homeowner would want in his or her landscape. And one additional thing. Whilst my plants were at J.F. Schmidt, because in New Mexico I didn't test for cold tolerance, they actually moved it to very cold environments to see how well it does in cold as well. And so this was not something I tested for, but something that J. Frank Schmidt did. And the plant is resilient or hardy down to a plant hardiness zone of 4. And what that means to say, zone 4 would mean that the plant can tolerate temperatures as low as minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 25.
Wow.
So, yes.
That is quite the range.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is one resilient tree you've cultivated.
Yes, we are very proud of it, and we think it will do well in the managed landscapes.
So talking a bit more about the commercial aspect of things, it's my understanding that the tree is now patented.
The patent is pending, but it is trademarked. Yeah.
Okay, but before that, it was licensed.
Yes,
and I believe, and you worked with the Arrowhead Center.
That is true. That's very true. Yes.
What was that whole process like?
Well, this is where Arrowhead shines. As a scientist, you usually huddle behind your desk and you do your work and you produce good data, and then you never think of the licensing process and how that works. And that worked really well with Arrowhead because once we decided that there was a cultivar out and there was commercial potential for it, we obviously had to protect our invention here. And J. Schrank-Schmidt had some agreements with already sort of boilerplate agreements in place for the people that they work with. But it wasn't really amenable to all the protections that we needed here at New Mexico State. So I worked with Arrowhead, and they were very good in having their group of attorneys take a look at it and come up with a licensing agreement that was amenable and agreeable to all parties. And they sort of, I sat back and provided them all the necessary information that was requested of me. But essentially, Arrowhead steered that process through completion, and we now have a robust licensing agreement in place thanks to Arrowhead. And working with Arrowhead was very, very easy to do, and they're just the consummate professionals in getting those licensing agreements in place. So I'm very pleased that I have licensing agreements that are amenable to all, and everybody's happy.
So it sounds like Arrowhead was instrumental in allowing you to be the scientist that hides behind their desk and gets the research done.
That's a very accurate way of putting it, yes. Well, some of the terms in there, and I thought, well, I'm not so sure that's in my physiology lingo. I need some help there.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's good to hear. So at what point are you at now? Are you at the point where working with J. Frank Schmidt that you're able to sell these, that they're on the commercial market?
Yes, they are. And in fact, the plant was introduced this year as one of the new introductions. It's got a catalog entry there in the new entry sales. The pre-sales, I understand now, have been exceeded expectations. So basically all the plants they promised to sell have been sold out.
So everything that you had available for pre-sale, they're gone.
Yes,
just gone.
Yes,
completely
yes.
sold out of your.
Completely sold out. Yes.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. So the way the product is being deployed, it first goes to what we call the wholesale market. So in other words, the wholesalers first get first dibs on it. And then now it filters its way, and that will happen next year, 2017, into the retail market. And as far as I understand, that is also running ahead of schedule in terms of the number of plants that are being requested and the number that are being produced. Now, as you know, trees take a long time to grow. So
yes, yeah.
So it's a matter of as we ramp, production has to be ramped up, and so that will take time. But we expect by 2017 and beyond, the plant will filter its way into the retail market. But right now, we're at wholesale market sales.
Yeah, I was about to say. I mean, when we started talking, you mentioned kind of beginning this entire process back in, I believe, 2002, and you now launched your launched your commercial tree in 2016. So you have over a decade invested into this project. That's phenomenal.
That is very true, and I just said that trees take a long time to grow, and so yes, any scientist who goes into selecting trees is in this for a very, very long haul, and we as scientists will be very fortunate that we actually get one in our lifetime, and usually we start the work and it's usually finished off by some other scientists because it takes such a long time the trees take us such a long time to grow. But in my case, I believe we accelerated the process by doing two things. One, the process that we use in getting materials from a wide variety of natural environments is something called progeny testing. And so sometimes that can be successful. And in this case, it was. And the other thing that we did was to partner with a commercial entity instead of us trying to ramp up our production facilities here at the institution. We basically partnered with somebody that already had a commercial production system in place. So that accelerated the process tremendously for us. And so we're able to get the plant into the market in a decade. And for the most part, this would take probably a generation, about 30 years. So we're very pleased that we could get the product into the commercial market in a decade. And that may seem like a very, very long time for most scientists. And that's been challenging in a way for my laboratory in terms of getting funding for that project. And so because I could go to a funding agency and said, well, could you support my research? And in 10 years' time, I might come back with a product. Well, that does not go well, in terms of, taking a chance. But some good things have come out of it now. I believe that now that we have a product that's out there. I can easily now go to funding agencies and say, well, we're working on this project. Here's a success we've garnered, and there are other things we want to do with the plant, and could you support us? So I think that it turns out to be a very good situation for us.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you've proven that you will stick it out for a decade to succeed with your research. So it's funny too, because if we had led, if we could have led with that, I would have asked like, how into you're clearly very passionate about the maple tree, and it comes across in the way you talk about it. You're just like, well, no, it has to have the right color, it absolutely has to. And it now at the end of our talk, there's no surprise to me whatsoever that you were able to put in so many years to come to this conclusion. So.
That is true. That is very true. I was very passionate about it. A lot of man hours or woman hours or grad student hours. We spent a lot of time looking at the plants. I spent a lot of time taking detailed notes on every individual plant that was in the greenhouse, and had a system where we effectively tracked the performance of all the plants. I critically pored over all the data that was being generated in our tests. And that's where the three plants sort of emerged or rose to the top, and that was looking at lots and lots of data. Looking at all the drought tolerance data, looking at the color data, looking at how well the plants grew. And there's a little, I believe, bit of expertise I brought to the table in that I wanted to look at a plant that actually represented the species in its purest form in terms of its foliage qualities. In other words, is this plant truly representative of the species of big-tooth maple? So in other words, I didn't want it to look like a sugar maple. I didn't want it to look like a black maple or a Japanese maple, some of these other maples. I wanted it to be truly representative of a what I consider to be a big-tooth maple. And that requires a considerable amount of decision and a considerable amount of observation to make sure that we get it right. And my commercial partners are very pleased with that, in that they noticed that I took a lot of time in ensuring that the plant was not only drought resistant, but also was really true to the big-tooth maple form. So we're very happy about that.
Oh, that's
extremely happy.
clearly, the smile on your face is telling it all. Yeah. So, well, great. Well, now that we're kind of reaching the end, what's next? What are you currently researching?
Well, the fun has just begun, actually. So I'll tell you why. So right now, because I know where some of the drought resilient plants are likely to come from, or likely to emerge, I've now started what's called selective breeding work. So I'm basically trying now to collect pollen from plants I consider to be elite maples, and I'm going to be trying to cross them with other maples to see if I can even develop a plant that's even more resilient or has a broader appeal. So that's where I'm currently working on. I have plants in my fields collections that produce in seeds, they produce in pollen, so that will allow me now to broaden my portfolio of big-tooth maple types. And I'm working on one other plant, but I'm not at liberty to disclose it right now.
I wasn't going to push you.
I started working on it about 3 years ago, and there's nothing to report at this time. I'm still doing the initial work on that. And so maybe in about 5 or 6 years' time, I may have some initial information to put out there. But right now, there's not much information I can give. And just to let you know, when I started working on big-tooth maples, I was asked the same question by at that time somebody in Ag Communications, and that was in 2003. And I had just worked on the plant for a couple of years by then, and he asked me, when will you have data? So I said, probably come back and talk to me in about 5 to 6 years' time. And he says, yeah. I said, yeah, that's right. Trees take a long time to grow, and that's when I can really give you some good information about whether or not this research is going to be successful. So that's
a long reminder to set.
Yeah.
6 years. Check in with Dr. Rolston. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I need to check in with him and his tree.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's great. I find it fascinating that now you're using your own tree to hopefully crossbreed and improve upon it or have different types.
Yep, that's correct. That's very, very true, yes. And that's what we're proposing now to provide some funding for us to do.
Well, wonderful. Well, Rolston, you've been fantastic. Thank you for coming on and sharing not only your time, but your research that's been over a decade in the making with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, wonderful. And folks, if you'd like to find out more about the Arrowhead Center, which we talked about helping Dr. Rolston in his research today, more information about that, and actually you yourself, Dr. Rolston, because you are indeed faculty, can be found over at nmsu.edu. Go check it out. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. We will see you next time.